This lecture recording will cover Chapter 1, An Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. And before I get into content, I just want to point out that if you are listening to this lecture recording, Chapter 1 actually falls into Learning Plan 2. And Learning Plan 1 covers Chapters 2 and 3. So if you are just starting off and this is the first lecture that you're listening to, I recommend that you consult your course calendar. And if you are indeed starting Learning Plan 2, you may proceed with listening to this lecture. But if you're starting Learning Plan 1, then you'll need to start with Chapter 2. So Learning Plan 2 then now turns our focus to the bigger picture of anatomy and physiology. And it starts out with some of the basic functions of living organisms, defining what the science of anatomy and the science of physiology is, and describing the various specialties of each discipline. This chapter is also going to be identifying the major levels of organization in living organisms and identifying the 11 organ systems in the human body. We'll explain the concepts of homeostasis and describe how negative feedback and positive feedback are involved in homeostatic regulation. The last two sections of this chapter will be using anatomical terms and introducing them to you to describe body sections, body regions, and relative positions. And we'll be identifying the major body cavities and their subdivisions. So there's 5 major functions that all living things possess. Responsiveness, also called irritability, or what I'm like at 9 a.m. without coffee. Responsiveness is an organism that can change in response to its environment. Its longer-term change is called adaptation. So all living things have the capacity of responsiveness. All living things can grow, and that can be an increase in size or an increase in the number of cells or an increase in the complexity of cells or some combination of all 3. Those all fall into the category of growth. So the process of developing a variety of cells is called differentiation, and that also falls into growth. Reproduction. All living things have some form of reproduction to create a new generation of similar organisms. Most living things have some capacity of movement or the ability to transport things within the internal environment of the organism, if not the ability to transport the organism itself through the external environment. So even a plant, which is rooted into the ground, still has the capacity to move carbon dioxide into the cell and oxygen out of the cell. So that counts as movement. And last, metabolism. The sum total of all the chemical reactions in an organism is metabolism, and I told you about that in Chapter 2 or Chapter 3. Chapter 2. And so metabolism uses resources it absorbs from the environment. It uses respiration for cellular production of energy. The organism is going to excrete waste products left over from any chemical reactions. That all falls under the umbrella of metabolism, and all living things have some metabolism. And so the emphasis of this class this semester is anatomy. And the word anatomy actually means a cutting open, and we define it as the structure of things or how things are built. The science of anatomy specifies where things are, what they're made of, and the physical relationships between parts. Okay, and so this is the main focus of this semester. And there's 2 major disciplines in anatomy. There's gross anatomy and microscopic anatomy. Gross anatomy is called macroscopic anatomy, and it studies visible structures. Macro means big. Includes surface anatomy, or the study of general form and superficial markings, regional anatomy, which is study of all superficial and internal features of a specific region of the body, and also systemic anatomy, so the study of the structure of major organ systems. Microscopic anatomy, on the other hand, studies structures that cannot be seen without magnification. So this is going to include cytology, which I told you about in the previous chapter, which is the study of internal structures of individual cells, and also includes histology, which is the study of tissues, groups of specialized cells and cell products that work together to perform specific functions. And so we'll be performing some cytology and histology in lab when we use our microscopes. The emphasis of advanced anatomy and physiology, so the next semester after this class, is physiology, or the function of the anatomical structures, which specifies how structures, organs, and systems work together and separately. So human physiology specialties include cell physiology, which is the study of functions of living cells. Special physiology is the study of physiology of specific organs. Systemic physiology is the study of all aspects of the function of specific organ systems. And then pathophysiology, or pathology, is the study of effects of disease on organs or organ systems and their functions. Now the next section looks at the levels of organization, and living organisms are very, very organized structures. This next section describes the levels of organization, and it starts with atoms all the way up to the entire organism. And so atoms, the stuff that we talked about in chapter 2, atoms are the smallest stable units of matter, and so the chemical level is the most fundamental level of organization. Do you remember what atoms combine to form? Molecules, right? And so the molecular shape defines function, and a combination of molecules, atoms, can form organelles, and organelles perform specific functions in the cell, which is the next level of organization. So pictured here where we have the atoms and molecules that combine to form a muscle cell. And earlier I defined a tissue as a collection of cells working together to perform a specific function. And when you have two or more tissues working together to perform a specific function, then you are at the tissue level. Pictured here is a union of those muscle cells into a section of muscle tissue, and the formation then of the heart as an organ that performs a specific function of pumping blood. Now, when you consider all of the tissues involved in performing an even greater task, not only pumping blood, but also directing and transporting it through the body, like those involved in the cardiovascular system, you're talking about an organ system level. And last but not least, the organism level, you have multiple organ systems all working together to maintain the health of an autonomous individual. The last learning plan reviewed the chemical level of organization in Chapter 2 and the basics of cellular level in Chapter 3. In the rest of the semester, we're going to be taking a closer look at each organ system, starting with the integumentary system in the next upcoming chapters. So the integumentary system protects against environmental hazards. It helps control body temperature, among other things. We're also going to be discussing the skeletal system in the following chapters. It provides support, protects tissues, stores minerals, and forms blood cells. The muscular system allows for locomotion. It provides support, and it produces heat to help maintain homeostasis. The nervous system directs immediate responses to stimuli, usually by coordinating the activities of other organ systems. The endocrine system directs long-term changes in activities of other organ systems. The cardiovascular system, as I alluded to, transports cells and dissolved materials, including nutrients, wastes, and gases. The lymphatic system is specifically designed to defend against infection and disease, and it returns tissue fluid to the bloodstream. The respiratory system is responsible for delivering air to sites where gas exchange can occur and between air and the circulating blood. It also produces sound for communication. The digestive system's main role is processing food and absorbing nutrients. The urinary system eliminates excess water, salts, and other waste products. And last but not least, the reproductive system produces sex cells and hormones. Pictured here is the male reproductive system, and also we have the female reproductive system, which performs similar tasks, but additionally supports embryonic and fetal development from fertilization to birth, and then provides nutrients for the neonate after birth. So I mentioned homeostasis. So let me define that term for you. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment, the result of interdependence of organ systems functioning together. So homeostatic regulation is the adjustments in physiological systems that preserve homeostasis. And a typical homeostatic loop contains a receptor that receives stimulus, a control center that will process and integrate information from the receptor, and then an effector that will respond to the control center to change the body's response. And so what we have pictured here is one of those loops, those control loops. Notice how homeostasis, the desired effect, is right here. So they're giving the example of temperature control as a means of homeostasis. So let's say that the normal condition is disturbed and your room temperature rises. Okay, so in your house you have a thermometer. Okay, and this acts as your receptor, and it collects information, and that information will then affect the control center, which is the thermostat. Okay, so if the room temperature rises above a certain threshold, that control center, your thermostat, will send a command to your air conditioner. And so the air conditioner then is the effector. And the effector's response to lower the room temperature will eventually restore the normal condition or homeostasis to a much more acceptable room temperature. And so this is a negative feedback loop example. And so in your body you have very, very similar receptors, control centers, and effectors. So if you understand how a thermostat works in your house, you can understand this negative feedback. And so that homeostatic regulation will control the aspects of your internal environment. And negative feedback, like the one I just described and the one that's pictured here, is probably one of the most common regulation mechanisms. So in negative feedback, your stimulus produces a response that will oppose the original stimulus. So if your body temperature is too high, the brain sends a message to the skin to vasodilate and sweat, and that will bring the temperature down. And vice versa, if the body temperature drops too low, the brain will send signals to your skeletal muscles to start shivering, to start contracting. And the blood vessels to the skin will vasoconstrict, and both of those mechanisms will bring your body temperature back up to achieve homeostasis again. Now, I mentioned negative feedback. You must be wondering about positive feedback. So positive feedback does exist. It's less common because it reinforces or it exaggerates deviations from normal. Of course, there's a threshold. It has to have an off switch so that it doesn't increase to a dangerous level. But an example that's given here is if a blood vessel is damaged, you have chemicals that are released to attract platelets to that damaged area. Okay, the platelets are going to release more chemicals, which will start a cascade of reactions that lead to a clot formation. And so each step enhances or exaggerates or encourages the next step in this positive feedback loop of clotting. Okay, and then eventually the repair of the damaged vessels will stop the first chemical secretions. at least until the skin regeneration or the vessel regeneration can occur. And so early anatomists face communication problems between countries, between groups, between just different And so what they did to overcome these communication problems, they created maps of the human body. So prominent anatomical structures serve as landmarks. Distances measured and specialized directional terms are now used so that we don't have to face these communication problems. And so anatomy almost uses a language of its own, and we call this language medical terminology. And so we're going to be using anatomically correct or medical terminology throughout this semester. Standard anatomical illustrations will show the human form in anatomical position. In anatomical position, the hands are at the side, the person is standing up, palms are facing forward, and the feet are together. A person laying down in the anatomical position is said to be supine when they're face up, and if they are face down, they are said to be prone. So this figure in your textbook illustrates a person that is in anatomical position with the anatomical terms in bold and common names in plain type. The anatomical adjectives are in parentheses. And so this figure is in your textbook to reinforce the anatomical terms. And hopefully throughout the semester you'll get comfortable with using the correct anatomical terms for these structures rather than the more common terms like eye, you might say oculus instead, or instead of ear, perhaps you'll refer to it as your aureus towards the end of the semester. And you'll get more comfortable with these terms as we go through the semester together. Some of the major regions of the body are referred to by the anatomical adjectives on the last figure. Broader terms are used to map the surface of the abdomen and the pelvis. So the abdominopelvic quadrants are the 4 abdominopelvic quadrants formed by 2 perpendicular lines that intersect at the navel. And the terms for these quadrants or their abbreviations are most often used in clinical discussions. So you have a right upper quadrant, a left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, and a right lower quadrant. So this is a figure on the left. And then the figure on the right is denoting the abdominopelvic regions. So the 9 abdominopelvic regions provide a more precise regional description. This figure is demonstrating anatomical directions. So anatomical directions provide an orientation of the structures relative to anatomical position. And remember that when you're talking about left or right, it's always in reference to the subject, not to you, the observer. But some of the important directions that we'll be using throughout the semester include superior and inferior, distal and proximal, lateral and medial. And these are usually a description in reference to the midline. So proximal meaning you're closer to the midline, distal meaning you're farther away from the midline. Lateral means the side, and medial means the middle. And then sectional anatomy. Sectional anatomy provides a slice through the body in 3 primary sectional planes. So a transverse plane, which is this green one pictured here, creates this image that divides the body into a superior or inferior portions. The frontal plane, then pictured here in the purple, which creates this image over here, a frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. And then last, a sagittal, pictured in blue. Sagittal will divide the body into left and right portions. Now, viewed in sections, the human body is not a solid object like a rock. Its interior is subdivided into 2 regions in relation to the body wall. The thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities are separated by the diaphragm, a sheet of muscle. And many vital organs within these regions are suspended within the fluid-filled internal chambers, which have two essential functions. They protect the internal organs, and they allow the organs to change shape. So the viscera and the cavity are both lined by these delicate membranes called serous membranes. And these serous membranes produce fluid that reduces the friction. The layer covering the organ itself then is called the visceral layer. And the one that lines the cavity is the parietal layer. But they're both serous membranes. The thoracic cavity has 3 internal chambers, 1 pericardial cavity, and 2 pleural cavities. Each cavity is defined by a serous membrane. The pericardial cavity contains the heart. It's defined by a serous membrane called the pericardium. The visceral pericardium is the layer that covers the heart, and the parietal pericardium is the outer layer. In between the 2 layers is the serous fluid that will reduce friction. Now each lung is found within its own pleural cavity. Serous membranes is the pleura, and visceral pleura is the layer that covers the lung. Parietal pleura lines the inner surface of the chest wall. Moving inferiorly, the abdominopelvic cavity is subdivided into a superior abdominal cavity and an inferior pelvic cavity. It will contain the parietal cavity lined with peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum covers the internal organs such as the liver, stomach, spleen, small intestines, and most of the large intestine. The parietal peritoneum is the membrane that lines the inner surface of the body wall. The inferior pelvic cavity then contains the distal portion of the large intestine, the urinary bladder, and various reproductive organs. And so with that, concluding the different cavities, that ends the lecture on Chapter 1.